So here I am on a somewhat cool and showery November morning on my 2019 CB500X on the way to my Honda dealer a couple of miles down the road. They're kindly lending me the new 2020 Africa Twin so that I can compare it to my 6-month-old 500. And that's the idea behind this video really. It's intended as a sort of follow-up to the 6-month review of the 500X I posted about a month ago. So I'm aiming it at owners of entry-level adventure bikes like the 500X. I'll be attempting to answer really just one question: is it worth upgrading to a premium machine? I'll be comparing the 500X mainly to the new Africa Twin, but also to a lesser degree to the ever popular BMW 1250 GS, which I rode a couple of months ago. Now, there are already plenty of videos and online reviews specifically about the 2020 Africa Twin, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here about the specs, but I'll quickly run through the main differences between the two bikes in question here. I'll give the figures first for the 500X and then by way of comparison those for the Africa Twin. Power: 47 horsepower at 8,600 revs per minute and 100 horsepower at 7,500 revs per minute. Torque: 43 Newton meters, Africa Twin 105. So basically the Africa Twin is twice as powerful as the 500X. Weight: 197 kilos for the 500X, between 226 and 240 kilos for the Africa Twin, depending on which model you go for. The seat height: 830 millimeters, which is quite reasonable on the 500X. Africa Twin between 850 and 870 millimeters, depending on which model you go for. And finally the price. As I said, the Africa Twin is basically 2 times more expensive. Price is between 14,500 and 18,000 euros, while the 500X comes in at just 6,800. The 500X is an excellent workhorse that I'm comfortable doing pretty much anything on, from nipping down to the post office to a quick blast through the mountains. It's a relatively cheap, a relatively basic bike with proven mechanicals that I can trust, and if I drop it or scratch it, then I'm not too worried about repair costs. But the Africa Twin, 2.5 times the price, I'm not sure I'd feel that comfortable about leaving it outside the post office or dropping those fragile active components. But cost and pride of ownership aside, how does it feel? What's it like jumping straight off the 500X and onto the new Africa Twin? Is it worth the price difference? Let's find out. The bike I borrowed was the top-of-the-range adventure sport with the DCT dual-clutch gearbox, and it's certainly a smart-looking machine with its anodized forks, gold-spoked wheels and smart livery. When I first got on the bike, it felt significantly taller than the 500X, and indeed the dealer said that the seat height was set to its maximum. I'm 6'3", so I could still flat foot relatively easily, though swinging my leg over the rear of the bike did prove a little bit more awkward. So all things considered, I was quite surprised when I lined the two bikes up for these photos to see just how similar in size they appear to be. I don't know if you can tell from these images, but there's only a slight difference in the overall size. Yes, the seat is higher and the front end more imposing on the Africa Twin, but I was expecting the 500X to look a bit dinky next to its larger sibling, and it just doesn't. The first thing I noticed when moving from my supremely comfortable, for an adventure bike, 500X, was how much firmer the seat on the Africa Twin feels. Because the height is greater, the front of the seat has to be made narrower to allow the rider to get their feet down onto the ground. And the padding also felt firmer, meaning that as a whole, the seat felt less comfortable than the one on my 500X. Maybe on longer journeys, which the Africa Twin is designed for after all, the design would come into its own, but for the short time I had the bike, I wasn't too convinced about seat comfort. LEDs all round on the 2020 Africa Twin, though all manufacturers seem to be going this way and my 2019 500X is no exception. The daytime running lights have a pleasing signature, but for some reason Honda have decided to also keep both front indicators permanently on at low intensity. Now, to me, this is going to make inattentive car drivers think the rider is turning and possibly pull out, and I'm astonished that Honda were even able to get these through EU regulations. There may be a way to deactivate them via the touch screen, but in my opinion, this is one idea that needs a quick rethink. The switchgear definitely feels more substantial than on the 500X, though there are too many buttons for my liking. No doubt after a couple of weeks riding, their operation will start seeping into muscle memory, but compared to the just sit on it and go approach taken by the 500X, the result is unnecessary complication. And to be honest, the same goes for the screen, really. The dealer was excitedly trying to show me all the features in the showroom, but I really wasn't that interested. When I buy a new car or a new bike, I trust the engineers at the factory to make it as good as it can possibly be. I don't want to spend hours scrolling through menus, minutely adjusting every conceivable parameter. Now, I know this depends on your riding. If you're planning a trip around the world or even across whichever continent you happen to be on, then no doubt the Africa Twin's configurability is an advantage. But for the kind of riding I do, frankly, it's overkill. And for all its configurability, I'm afraid it doesn't come close to the dash found on the 1250 GS, which is better looking, more modern, easier to read and more intuitive. Not quite sure what purpose this Ducati Diavol style auxiliary screen serves, but it's almost as illegible on the fly as the main screen. So what's the Africa Twin like to ride? The bike I was given apparently had its seat set to its maximum height of 870mm. Now I'm 6'2" or 1m87, and so could still flat foot okay, just. But swinging my aging right leg over the rear of the bike required some careful planning. Slightly embarrassing when you see how Jocelyn Snow completely owns her full-size GS, despite only measuring 5'1", 1m55.
Green light. Oh, shoot. Oh. I was ran over turtle, but we're good. Now I gotta start from this side. Whatever. I'm in balance. Doesn't matter.
I only had the bike for a couple of hours, so I didn't really have the time to test its off-road or motorway abilities. And as you can see, it was pouring as rain for the first session along the coast road towards Lisbon. As with the 500X, painted road markings are best avoided as far as possible in the wet, though I'm beginning to wonder if the Portuguese authorities didn't buy a job lot of extra slippery paint, possibly from the same people who sold them the extra slippery cobbles they use on all the pavements, because the microslides in the wet are all too common, and it's something I haven't experienced in other countries. Now, given the conditions, I put the bike in touring mode to begin with, and the engine felt plenty powerful enough, but way less excitable than my 120 horsepower street triple. To be honest, it felt more like 85-90 horsepower than 100 horsepower, and so once the rain subsided, I put it in sport mode. Now, this is the mode I think I'd definitely be using most of the time if I owned the bike, because it really comes alive and begins to feel a lot more like the BMW 1250 GS. Power delivery is a lot smoother, and the DCT gearbox even seems a lot less jerky and hesitant than it does in touring mode. It's not quite up there with the silky smooth GS, though of course this has a shaft drive rather than the Africa Twin's chain. Perhaps more importantly, it's not quite as smooth as the 500X either, and this despite the latter's imperfect fueling at low revs. The DCT gearbox on the Africa didn't help, of course, because without a torque converter, you'll never get genuinely seamless transmission shifts. I also realised what that mini screen is for. When you connect your smartphone to the main display, the entire screen is taken over by Apple CarPlay. I wasn't able to test the Android Auto function as I only have an iPhone, meaning the secondary display is your sole source for current speed and gear. I have to say the CarPlay screen also looks a lot better, more modern than the standard display, which, as I've already mentioned, contains information which is as illegible as it is superfluous. So before I draw a conclusion, let's take a look at three things that I liked about the Africa Twin compared to the 500X, and then three things I was a bit disappointed by. First of all, the power. 100 horsepower is what you need on a bike if you're going to deal with every situation. Most of the time, of course, you'll only be using half that, but sometimes you need a little extra shove, and I miss not having that on my 500. In touring mode, the AT is good, but it really comes alive in sport mode, and that's definitely what I'd keep it in if the bike were mine. The extra power would also be useful for two-up riding. My wife and I occasionally ride up into the mountains together on the 500, and despite her only weighing about 46 kilos, the extra weight can definitely be felt. I didn't have time to try the Africa with a pillion, but I would imagine it's much less of a strain on the bike, particularly as the test bike had the adjustable suspension, which could be configured via the touchscreen to adjust for a passenger and/or extra luggage. The second thing I like about the Africa Twin is its road presence. Once you're on, you're sitting in a more commanding position, and the Africa's extra width makes for a greater road presence than you get on the 500. And finally, number 3, no surprise here, the lack of vibrations. My biggest gripe with the 500X is the vibration above 6,000 revs. It's not really a problem on short runs, but I certainly wouldn't fancy crossing continents with it, at least if I was sticking to motorways, simply because the buzziness quickly results in tingly hands and feet. I didn't feel any of that on the Africa Twin. Now 3 things I was a little bit disappointed by. First of all, the engine. While peppy enough in sport mode, it doesn't come close to the 1250 GS in terms of smoothness and general potency. The GS is a seriously quick machine in its own right, while the AT just felt quick in comparison to the 500X. Now, second and perhaps the biggest disappointment is the feel or the premiumness, if there is such a word, of the Africa Twin. My intentions in comparing it with the 500X were to decide whether the Africa is worth 2.5 times the price. And I'm afraid I don't think it is. Now, this is as much down to how astonishingly competent the 500X is for the money, but also to the fact that the Africa doesn't ooze the same quality or command the same admiration as the similarly priced GS does. You just don't feel as special on the Africa Twin as you do on the BMW, or at least I didn't. If the 500X is the Suzuki Jimny of the bike world, then I was really expecting the Africa Twin to be a Range Rover. The BMW certainly was, but it just didn't feel as premium enough to justify the price. It's good and it's less utilitarian than the 500X, but it's more Ford Edge than Range Rover. Finally, number 3 on the list of disappointments, the seat comfort. The Africa Twin is a tall bike and therefore has to have a narrow seat to ensure the more vertically challenged have a fighting chance of touching the ground. Now this, together with the lack of padding, makes the seat less comfortable overall than the one on the 500X. So the key question that I was setting out to answer at the beginning of this video: is it worth my upgrading from a 2019 Honda CB500X to the new 2020 Africa Twin? Now the French have a good expression, le mieux est l'ennemi du bien, literally, better is the enemy of good. The original Africa Twin was good and it was cheap relatively. Honda here have felt the need to aim the second version at the high profit margin premium market currently dominated by the BMW 1250 GS. Problem is, they haven't quite pulled it off. The Africa Twin has got a premium price tag without managing to make you feel special. So Honda, if you're watching, the Africa Twin is very nice, but what we really need now is a CB650X. In other words, a 500X with a little more power, fewer vibrations, a couple of extra bits like twin disc front brakes or a nicer dash, and a price tag of around 10,000–11,000 euros. What do you think? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below, and as always, thanks for watching.